So on behalf of the organizing committee, I would like to welcome everyone to Issues on Disaster Relief and Humanitarian Aid Conference. We're excited to see many prominent intellectuals and experts on these issues. Before giving the word to our keynote speaker, I would like to thank Global Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and Niagara Foundation, which is a non-profit organization that promotes intellectual debate on important international and national issues. I would like to also thank African Studies Program, Dialogue International, Latin American, Caribbean, and Iberian Studies Program, the Division of International Studies Program, and the Middle East Studies Program for co-sponsoring this conference. Please join me in welcoming Naim Kapucu, our scientific advisor, to introduce our keynote speaker, Louise Comfort, and say a few words about the conference. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Let me just tell you how I engaged with this workshop first. I have a very good friend, history graduate, Professor Alagos at this campus. He sent me an email a couple months ago, and he said there are people are organizing this workshop on disaster relief and humanitarian assistance, and I told them that we can help them out. And can I contact you with them? This is how the network started. I said, well, of course, why not? And Mehmet asked me, and we had several phone conversations before we actually finalized the theme of the conference. And he said, it's probably impossible to find enough people to cover disaster relief. I said, what? I can give you 20 people on the topic right now, on top of my head. And we did that actually. I gave him several names, and we started organizing the panels, and many of you were included in the list I provided to him, and I'm glad most of you were able to make it. And this is really an interesting, very focused conference and a workshop, and I'm sure the expectations and the presentations and the experiences from practitioners and scholars around the country and some experiences around the world will be quite beneficial for us in academic scholars and also practitioners in the field of disaster relief and humanitarian assistance. It is my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker today for the conference. And it is really an easy job for me. Probably I can mention at least two-page biography of Professor Louise Comfort. She was my mentor at the University of Pittsburgh, still my mentor. Any time and every time I need anything, I go back to her, and any suggestion I get is always right and always helps me in my professional investment. So Professor Louise Comfort is the Professor of Public and International Affairs at the University of Pittsburgh, Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. She is also the Director of the Disaster Management Center at the university. She received a BA degree in Political Science and Philosophy from Macalester College, a Master's degree in Political Science from the University of California, Berkeley, and PhD in Political Science from Yale University. She has several articles on disaster management, emergency management, more than 6 books, edited volumes on the same subject, and she is teaching policy analysis, public administration, organizational theory, disaster studies, and information communication technology in disaster management at the University of Pittsburgh. She's been probably more than 15 countries doing field study on disaster-related issues, including Turkey, China, India, Haiti, and several other countries. And it is, I'd like to welcome Professor Louise Comfort.
This is on. Thank you, Naim, very much. It's a pleasure to be here in this beautiful campus overlooking the lake. And I have to say, it's a real joy for me, for others of you who are teachers. The most important reward, I think, in this profession is watching your students graduate, join the profession, and become scholars in their own right. And Naim Kapucu has certainly done that. And watch him to develop. I also really want to congratulate the faculty here at the University of Washington for selecting this topic, issues in humanitarian aid, as the subject of a major conference. It's a problem that I've worried about for the last 25, almost 30 years as I started studying disaster. Really looking at decision-making under conditions of uncertainty. I was looking for a field study environment. I started teaching in California. The disasters roll through California. If it's not earthquakes, it's fire. If it's not fire, it's floods. If it's not floods, it's civil riots. And so the whole issue of figuring out what to do for disaster managers when they're in a situation that most of them have never seen before, but they've got legal responsibility to act, so they must do something. And so this particular problem on decision-making in uncertain, changing, dynamic conditions has been one that has fascinated me literally all my career. And if starting to study earthquakes in California, I easily became involved in international disaster response because, as you know, earthquakes occur in any one location, moderate earthquakes, every 40 to 60 years. It's off the budget cycle of any state or indeed country. And major earthquakes, like the Galtogan disaster or the Westlawn earthquake, occur, on a scale of 300 to 1,000 years, which is truly off anyone's planning cycle. But the consequences are different, are still the same. People need to take action. What action should they take? How should they, where did they get the information? How can they improve their process? And so this is figure out how to work this. Forward? Okay. Easy, you just press the button. So the real question is, how can we manage these events on a global scale? We all know that disasters don't respect political boundaries. We see this in any one country when disasters spill across states, as in Superstorm Sandy in the U.S. or Hurricane Katrina that affected at least 5 states. But in the international arena, the disasters also spill across borders, as some nations don't have the capacity to respond. The United Nations has an obligation for all member nations to assist one another. And then, but the question is still the same. What do you do in a situation where your resources are overwhelmed, people need assistance? How can you mobilize that assistance? And most important, how can you reduce it? We understand hazards, and what we get is the interaction between physical, technical, social, and economic systems that then create damaging events and any kind of natural hazard, any kind of earthquake that happens, for example, in the Mojave Desert in California, where there isn't a soul around, isn't a major event. But if that same earthquake, 6.8, 6.9, should happen in San Diego or Los Angeles, we've got a disaster. And so it's the interaction with human systems, community systems, transportation systems, and social systems that make the difference. And this then means we really need, if I can, I should be able to, oops, no, I didn't want to do that. No, I don't want to do that. It really requires an integrated, interdisciplinary approach. And I've been looking at an approach that has been developed really with a set of engineers at Sandia National Laboratory, which is called a complex system of systems, and trying to formalize a process of inquiry for these difficult things. But the basic point of this approach is if we really want to manage hazards, we need to facilitate self-organizing collective action. So the vision that I'd like to present today is really one of a global effort to reduce disaster risk. We've had statements of global efforts before, the International Decade for Natural Hazard Disaster Reduction really articulated a global vision. But we haven't been very good in putting this into practice and coming up with practical steps on how to do this. So first, we really need to develop responsible leadership, but then build the capacity at the community level to reduce disaster risk. And here, I think we need to design a model of learning and action where we connect the learning process to the actions that people take, which often is separated when you see lists of plans and books of plans that are on the shelves of agencies. And in this way, we really need to expand the capacity of organizations to function in a complex arena. Most organizations worry about their own mission, their own requirements, their own resources, but don't take into account that their capacity to act often depends on their neighboring organizations' actions and the influence that they can build and the technical infrastructure within which they act. If the communications are down, they can't communicate. If the roads are destroyed or the bridges are out, they cannot move to that area. So we really need to look at these environments, often destroyed in disaster, and find ways of building capacity for organizations to operate in seriously damaged environments. And so our challenge is really how do we develop and maintain effective performance for managing risk in uncertain conditions. Many times this management aspect is left out of consideration for international efforts. When a disaster occurs, the world rushes in response and assembles a lot of materials, some of which is needed, some of which is not, and tries to do something good. But in fact, a more difficult question is what is the appropriate action to take in this time, in this place, with these organizations that will enable them to rebuild their own community. And the whole issue of enabling a collective capacity to act really requires understanding what is that shared goal to reduce disaster risk. And this really is what we mean by resilience, which is the capacity of organizations to survive, literally, damaging events and use those events as opportunities to test their strength, learn how to interact with other organizations, and adjust their existing performance to meet the new conditions in which they operate. So one of the key things we're doing, and so I study government, I'm interested in what governmental agencies do, been involved in emergency management, know that government agencies develop emergency plans, but in actual events, I've seen those plans totally fall apart. So the contrast between plans and action is one of the real dilemmas that we have to solve. In the planning process, people are really trying to, reduce the risk to which they're exposed. But the irony is that very often they will develop their current plans based on the experience of the previous disaster. And it's just like generals who are developing plans based on the last battle or the last war. The last disaster may not be the same set of challenges that the next disaster will be. And consequently, consequently, in many societies, what we have is people that are developing plans for events that aren't exactly, that are never going to occur again, but a new event with a different pattern of interdependencies, challenges, difficulties will appear. And if the focus is on the last event, they are less willing, less able, less capable of responding and adjusting and adapting to the event that is occurring at the moment at that time. So the real question is, how do we plan for events that may happen based on the knowledge of the past? So today I would just like to share with you some perspectives from two disaster events that have happened relatively recently, the 2010 Haiti earthquake and the 2011 Tohoku disasters in Japan, and look at the contrast between planning and action in both countries. Now, if we look at Haiti and Japan, we think worlds apart, right? So we've got Haiti, planning was essentially non-existent, previous earthquake 200 years ago. There were absolutely no building codes. People in Haiti, ordinary people, were really not aware of seismic risk. Very fragile government at that time trying to recover, very fragile economy, literacy rate at only 56%, and a profound lack of awareness of seismic risk, and with that, a profound lack of a collective capacity for action for the whole society. So if you look at what happened in Haiti, no one is surprised, right? Earthquake, 2010, magnitude 7.0 on a Richter scale. In California, the buildings would withstand that. In Japan, it would rattle, a 7.0 would rattle the teacups. But in Haiti, the consequences were really disastrous. 230,000 people estimated, lives were lost, 1.5 million people homeless, 80% of the buildings in the city were destroyed. And we see the impact of this disaster in Haiti without resilience. So, and the photographs show this. On the right is a presidential palace. The president, famously said he had no place to sleep that night of January 10th. And this photograph here on it's my right, your left, is the Ministry of Public Works, and the ministry was, of course, responsible for connecting the transportation, communications systems, water, sewage systems in Haiti. And the capacity of the government was seriously limited. 11 of 12 ministries in Haiti were destroyed. This essentially was the partial management of the government of Haiti, where they set up tents literally right across from the presidential palace. But this is what is interesting, is look who responded. And what we see, maybe this is, I'm looking for, is there a, sorry, I'm not doing this. I'll just point this out. Nearly 75%, quarters of the organizations that responded in Haiti were international. And then it goes down. Regional means the Caribbean, so it's Dominica, Barbados, Cuba, Jamaica, all little tiny island states, all of which support. National, these were literally only 11 organizations, and local organizations only one. And I will have to say, these data came from a content analysis of the Caribbean News Online, which was a regional newspaper trying to get local organizations. But these were the organizations that were identified and reported in this local newspaper. Now, what was interesting is that in actual fact, there were a whole lot more local organizations that were operating that were not being noticed, were not being photographed, were not emerging into the international dialogue. And we show this with the network diagram, which shows the interacting organizations. And it's hard for you to see this, but red means international, blue means regional, gray are the national organizations, and if I had a pointer, I would point out the government of Haiti and the Ministry of Health of Haiti. But there's only one local organization, which is the little black triangle up in the right-hand.
Pointer?
Oh, I would love a pointer.
Okay.
Thank you, thank you. Thank
Everything
you.
is good.
And this-
Again, butter.
This one.
Lemon, and then you would just okay. You plug this here. You have a pointer, you pick this up.
Oh, good. Okay. I'd like to show you, this is the only local organization that is right there. Now, I will say, there were many other local organizations that were operating under the radar in Haiti. And these were family, friends, church groups, people, little neighborhood groups, but were recognized and were basically people helping one another. And now, see, now I've got two instruments. How do I change? There, oh, this one. Okay. So now let's switch to Japan, and we would expect a very different situation in Japan, right? Advanced planning, major industrial economy, number 3 in the world, and what we have is heavy investment in planning and preparedness for earthquake risk, but not very much knowledge, awareness, or planning for tsunami risk. And in the nuclear area, the planning was essentially left to the private engineering companies who ran it. And so what we have in Japan is asymmetry of information among the jurisdictions and between the different types of hazards. And this situation literally created this cascade of risk and failure that led to this devastating black swan event, which was really beyond anyone's imagination. Oops. There. And so here we have in Japan, much stronger earthquake, 9.0, but literally for Japan, almost 20,000 deaths. Almost 130,000 buildings destroyed. Economic impact for Japan, 25 billion yen, an estimated, 330 billion US dollars. And more serious, almost 78,000 people forced to evacuate their homes in response to the nuclear threat. They still don't know if and when they will be able to return. And so we look at the devastation. This was a photograph that I took almost 8 months after the event in Minami Sanriku, which was a coastal community. And here is evidence of Japan's effort at planning for tsunamis, where they built the city is a small city, a coastal city in northeastern Japan named Taro, and they built a tsunami wall, and this wall was 10 meters high. They built it after there was a major tsunami in in this town, that struck this town in 1896, another in 1933, I believe. And so they built the tsunami wall to 10 meters high, which was the height of the last tsunami. And the tsunami came in, you see through the open area here, over top that wall, destroyed part of it, devastated. What you see in front is the, thank you, are the buildings, you know, the footprints of the buildings that were destroyed. This was the town of Taro. Its major commercial section depended largely on the fishing industry, and it was gone. So the painful part of this photograph is it represents significant planning, significant events, awareness by the community that there is a tsunami risk, but they totally underestimated the size, scope, and scale of that risk. And this is a very poignant photograph. It's the Disaster Management Center that was actually built in the town of Minami-Sanriku. And you see the radio tower at the top. The woman who was responsible for making announcements of the tsunami was on the top of that building, broadcasting to people, tsunami is coming, get out of the way. The tsunami came and swept her away. Literally, almost all of the staff in that building.
If I may say, and in the back you have the hospital,
Yes,
and everybody died in that hospital, except the people who made it to the roof.
right,
The building on the back.
this staff.
That's the hospital.
Right, which is really sobering. I had another photograph of that hospital too. Enough of sad photographs. But I wanted to show this because we see how the participation at the jurisdictional levels, oops, come back here. At the jurisdictional level changes. And here we have a relatively small group of international organizations participating. I will say this is the nuclear network, not the entire network for response, because we did identify 3 separate networks, one for earthquake response, one for tsunami response, and one for the nuclear response. But this organization, or this chart was the most telling, and the response, I'm sorry to say, was the least effective in Japan, where we have a small proportion of international organizations, a large proportion of national organizations, and then it goes down prefectural, municipal, and local organizations. The key difference in this, 58% of national organizations included the national engineering companies as well as the public organizations. Or, excuse me, these were, public. And you see here, the private organizations, these are the private engineering companies, are the dominant, almost dominant group, almost the, close to the same level of participation as the national organizations. And here is the network for Japan. It's a much denser network. But what is surprising here is, in terms of international organizations, much smaller proportion. And the critical issue here was on the lack of knowledge of the consequences of this nuclear event for the communities when initially international engineering, nuclear engineering experts responded from the US, from Germany, from France, from the UK, to assist, and the private companies, not the Japanese government, the private companies refused. It was particularly sobering for me because the design of the Fukushima Daiichi plant is exactly the same as the design of the Westinghouse nuclear plant that was developed in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And the engineers from Westinghouse immediately got on the phone, called their counterparts, offered to help and say, you know, we know about this reactor, we designed it, there's some things you can do. And the organizational barriers were such that the engineers in Japan refused this international help. Finally, you know, a week or so later, after the consequences had escalated, they did respond. And so the comparison of these two events is really interesting if we're interested in developing a global commons. So we see that networks of response actions did emerge in both Haiti and Japan, but in both countries, they were strongest at the local level. And at the local level was where there was the least investment, public investment, the least education. It was mostly people helping one another. I will say in Japan, people, you know, more readily took action. The mayor of Fukushima decided he was just going to talk to his people. He wasn't going to wait for the national government to tell him what to do. A lot of the local Japanese farmers went out and bought Geiger counters on their own to determine, you know, the level of radioactivity in their plants. A lot of households in Japan just picked up and left. But the sobering part is here's a major disaster where there's relatively little interaction from international to national to local, you know, to prefectural to local government. In many cases, in Minami-Sanriku, one of the prefectures that was so seriously damaged, the people at the prefectural level said, we don't know what's going on. We're not able to talk with them. Cell phone towers were down, communications were out. They were literally checking in to news reports from other countries to find out. So the key issue literally is not only coordinating action at one level, but it's coordinating action, information, and action across the scales of operation in such an event, and taking a systems approach, recognizing that we're operating in a complex adaptive system. So if we're going to be able to use resources from other countries, which can be knowledge, it can be backup, you know, facilities, etc., that we really, to reduce disaster risk, we really need to develop ahead of time this socio-technical capacity to share information and create an adaptive, iterative learning environment. So what I'm proposing is we redesign this global community, and I think this is a good group that can take at least a start. We've got some hope, we've got some challenges, we've got some especially new technologies that we can use, and they have altered especially the capacity for communication, for sharing knowledge, for the exchange of knowledge, and for building a learning capacity among large groups of people, broad scale, regional responses, and especially across scales of operation. We need to recognize that the greatest resource, literally, that we have for dealing with disaster risk is our human capacity to learn. And this happens at every level, local, prefectural, national, etc. The hard part, and this is the challenge, and especially for us involved in universities, is designing these environments that enhance collective learning and that builds resilience. And in fact, you know, this is a classic statement by a professor that the responsibility falls to those who understand. But the next question is, how can we actually do this? And we see that the comparison of these networks of action emerged in both Haiti and Japan at the local level. And, so the proposal that I would really like to share with you is this concept of building resilience in a complex adaptive system of systems. Resilience, the capacity to adjust, adapt, change your performance in response to the conditions that you're operating in, really requires an understanding of the mechanisms of change in each component system. Whereas Japan understood very well earthquake risk, and it had the capacity for communicating to people what that risk was, well-practiced plans to enable people to move to shelters, etc. They didn't understand very well the mechanisms of tsunami risk, and they really didn't understand the mechanisms of nuclear risk. In advanced industrial societies, when these systems are interacting, the challenge to us is really to identify what those interdependencies are and to anticipate possible strategies of action for minimizing them. And this requires a very rapid, dynamic adaptation by the whole community. One single organization, TEPCO Electric Power in Japan, can't manage it for all of Japan, nor could any single organization in any other country. And so what we see, and in my judgment need to develop, is really a web of practice that is supported by socio-technical systems. So in building community resilience, starting at the local level, we really need to develop the concepts, methods, institutions that are designed to first detect the potential threats and then to be able to transmit the data and the information to the range of organizations that respond, are needed to respond to these risks, and also at the same time analyze the potential impact of those threats on a community so we know where to allocate scarce resources, and then, with luck, represent that risk visually to managers at multiple scales of action as they can understand risk, or most people can understand risk when they see it visually better than if you tell them or send them a report. So this is a representation of a conceptual schema that we're working with at the University of Pittsburgh, at our Center for Disaster Management. It's really an adaptation of a model that was developed at Sandia Laboratories. But you see, it's a set of circular, iterative learning loops where, those of you with engineering backgrounds will understand. First we're designing, defining the problem, then designing a solution, then we're testing that solution in an actual context, and then we're evaluating that, and then we go back and do it all over again. But it's this continual process of monitoring risk, using the incoming information to inform the next step, so we're able to keep our resources and actions targeted in a more constructive way. And so what actual steps do we take? Well, first we identify who are the actors, what are the conditions that characterize the risk, and what factors contribute to it. And so these are the initial conditions of complexity theory. And if you can characterize your community or your level of operation, so you know not only what the risk is, but also what the resources are, and you can use that information to inform the potential actors, and this is all the actors, so it's the government, it's the businesses, it's the nonprofit organizations, it's ordinary households. And we're looking here not at the flow of money, but at the flow of information, because what we're trying to create is a learning environment to enable people to manage their own risk. And then the key question is what means are most effective in communicating this risk with very diverse community groups. Japan, you know, you've got farmers, you've got businessmen, you've got fishermen, you've got, you know, national officials and agencies in Tokyo, a quite diverse group. Haiti, you've got a very different group as well that make up the population. So then once we design this, you know, we can develop probably sets of decision support tools or information tools or monitors. You know, Japan has a very extensive seismic risk station where literally earthquakes and the information about earthquakes, the magnitude, the location, the depth, etc., are transmitted via a radio network into people's homes. It comes up on their television screens. It can also be communicated in rolling newsreels, you know, in airports and other public places. So the technology to both detect and communicate risk is here. The harder part is including this in organizations that can use this information and get it to the people who need it. One of the things we've been very interested in is the use of social media, Twitter, Facebook, rapid means of communication, cell phones. Almost everyone has a cell phone, literally almost anywhere on the planet these days. And how can these media be used more effectively to communicate risk? And then in implementing the chaos, what configuration of sensors, communication, telecommunication networks, etc., are appropriate for actual communities? The hard part is to translate a set of plans to a real community with real people and real organizations and real risk, try it out, engage the people in this process, get them to identify both what they can and cannot do, and especially what methods of communication are effective or efficient for warning large numbers of people at risk. You know, cell phones go to, you know, individual people. You know, how can you communicate the risk of a major tsunami in Japan to, you know, literally dozens of communities or, you know, hundreds of communities along a coastal areas? And then, importantly, how do we put this in place? And this takes time, it takes investment, it takes commitment, and it really places the focus on action. So the key process is, you know, really designing some laboratory prototype experiment, probably on a small scale, in communities that are exposed to risk. And we're actually trying to do this in Haiti right now. And so the assumptions that we have for future risk is that we've got a new set of tools, and our challenge in advanced technology, especially in communications, but also in sensor networks. And how can we use the information, these tools, to gather the information about risk, to analyze it, and give informed information, not just to decision makers at the government level, but also to decision makers in businesses, nonprofit organizations, and at the community level. Especially, how can this work within the international framework of the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Assistance? And this is a process where we're really looking at using different patterns of communication for different groups, but fitting the method of communication appropriately to the recipients of that information in a way that engages them and collective effort. And so it's an iterative process of inquiry that, in my judgment, leads to this new science of resilience. And that's it.
So, yeah. So we can get questions from the audience.
Yes.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you could compare and contrast, say Japan's experience with Fukushima against, say, Katrina and Sandy, two different American experiences. It struck me that the nationalization response was sort of stubbornly slow in the Fukushima situation and perhaps the Katrina situation, and maybe not so much in the Sandy situation. But what are your impressions comparing those three events?
Well, it's very, I think you're right. I think it was, however, in Katrina, it wasn't only the national response that was slow. It was, the response failed on all four levels. You know, the mayor of New Orleans ordered the mandatory evacuation on Sunday night. Katrina struck Monday morning at 6 o'clock, right? He was worried that he was going to lose businesses in the hotels instead of listening to Max Mayfield, who was the director of the National Hurricane Center. Kathleen Blanco in Baton Rouge, 60 miles away, said, oh, good grief, she had come in. Her job as a new governor of Louisiana was to deal with business development. So she had actually changed her entire preparedness staff at the Louisiana Office of Emergency Services and Preparedness. And the people who had experience, who were focused on GIS, she had a very strong GIS laboratory just down the street at LSU, had literally lost contact with them, did not stay in contact with the director of the LSU Hurricane Center, who was advising her, saying, it's coming, you've got to do something. And once it occurred, then communications were lost. She didn't know what the situation was in New Orleans. Other people, you know, notably Anderson Cooper from CNN, you know, standing in the wind with his red jacket, you know, telling people this is the situation. And Kathleen Blanco was saying, we don't have electricity in New Orleans. He's holding a microphone, he's being filmed. The entire country sees the discrepancy and the failure. Federal government, same thing. The difficulty in Katrina was not the lack of planning. There were plans in place. It was really the inability of, and I'm sorry to say this, but I will, incompetent people at all four levels of government in leadership positions that had not done the training and preparedness and engaged people in the kinds of actions that were necessary, an event that was off the scale of their imagination. Now, let's switch to Sandy. The news reports on Sandy were really that the national government performed much better and much more effectively. And I think this was true. The warning systems for Superstorm Sandy came in, the National Weather Service, you know, broadcast images of the storm, starting out in Haiti, coming up the coast, and their, you know, hurricanes are a little easier, you get 3 days notice. FEMA was determined it wasn't going to be caught in a Katrina situation before, so they pre-positioned supplies, troops, personnel, and in fact, very successfully, they got people out of the way. Given a storm of that size, there were only, you know, the initial reports, I think, were 57 dead, or 59, and then later some consequences. But the hard part for Superstorm Sandy came after the storm was over. Infrastructure was destroyed, electricity was out, and this was late October, early November. The whole power capacity, gasoline shortage capacity was there. The managers of the business organizations and the nonprofit organizations were not included in the governmental planning process. So the people that were hurt most severely in Sandy were the small businesses, the nonprofit organizations, the convalescent homes, where Mayor Bloomberg in New York, looking at convalescent homes, people who were asking him, shall we evacuate, not evacuate? He said, don't evacuate. You're going to be in, people get harmed in evacuation, you'll frighten them, you'll be fine. Well, you've got a convalescent home of 250 people in their 70s and their 80s with health problems, mobility problems. The electricity goes out, there are no elevators, there's no heat, there's no water, there's no sanitation. They can't stay in that building. At this point, if you've not planned for, an evacuation that requires extensive pre-positioning of resources and planning, it's very difficult to do. So what do? Well, they sent buses, and they load these people on these buses. And then somebody says, well, where are we taking them? And the bus driver says, I don't know. So they took them to schools, which were designated as shelters. And they set, old people up in shelters. And they were there for about a week. And then the families in these communities said, oh, our kids need to go back to school. We've got to move the people out. So they then took them to armories. Well, in New Jersey, in armories, there is a law. The armories can only be used for civil defense purposes. So they had to move them again. And they ended up putting them in New York hotels at $300 a night. Not exactly good planning, nor very efficient. And at this point, it was the managers, the government, FEMA's responsibilities don't go to the recovery process after the fact. So these were the convalescent homes and the senior citizen centers that are scratching their heads saying, what do we do? They ended up taking them to old resorts in the Poconos in Pennsylvania and that were empty during the winter, but by that time they're 150, 200 miles away from their homes and any kind of source of support. Not exactly. Who's responsible? This is a community resilience problem. And it's one that can only be solved when you engage the hospitals and the convalescent homes and the schools and the local community people in this process. Now, where were the state agencies? Most of the state agencies in both New York and New Jersey were hopelessly uninformed and unprepared for managing an event of that consequence across a range of cities and communities of different sizes. New York City is not, disaster is not new to New York City. World Trade Center, 9/11, several hurricanes, etc. But it's creating this wide area, regional capacity. We actually analyzed, data from this and saw the extent people were offering assistance as far away as California and Toronto. But after the fact, it's too late. People are already suffering. And bottom line is, it costs 4 times at least more. And once you have an event like this, either people suffer, die, or you pay the price. And so, with luck, we can change that.
Let me add to your comments. We have looked quite closely to both Katrina and Sandy and any major disaster in instance. An important distinction that we typically forget that Katrina was a catastrophic event. Sandy was not. And basically there was some local capacity able to respond. In Katrina, the local capacity was gone. And it was also accentuated by the decision of the federal government in case of Katrina. The emergency declaration that basically enabled the states to mobilize resources and to be paid by the feds was issued one day before. When we did our post-mortem after Katrina, we found that the government was advised to deploy, to activate what they call the commodity plan, which is basically the prepositioning of supply. And she refused to do so, because if she does that before the emergency declaration, the state has to pay for that. And they decided to wait for the declaration of federal emergency. And basically, that happened a day before. And by the time and the federal declaration was issued because the guys from NOAA threatened to go public and raise hell. And then in the higher up in the White House, I mean, got really scared because this guy was really crazy. And basically they did it. Because without that, nothing would have been done.
Well, and there were some added complications that go back to planning in this process, because the initial, and you know, to give FEMA credit, even at that time, they were honestly trying to change this, because they did have the national, they had now, after 9/11, developed the national disaster response plan, which, you know, presumably engages people at all levels. But it wasn't very well known. It wasn't very well implemented. Most people at the local level didn't know that, including Kathleen Bonko, and including, I'm sorry to say, Michael Chertoff, who pulled the national response framework off the shelf and was trying to read, you know, what his responsibilities were before he went on TV that night. I mean, literally, uninformed people in positions of responsibility that didn't know really how to adjust and how to adapt in response to information that was coming in.
No, we interviewed many of the people from the boards, the local Red Cross, and they were telling me, Jose, that wasn't with Katrina. We had to, it was frightening, that's what I said. We had to tell them what they're supposed to be doing.
Yeah, oh, I'm sure.
I mean, the thing I could tell you that, I mean, I could spend 3 hours on that.
No, I'm sure.
Sounds like you need more civil service and less a political appointee in those top positions. Is that maybe a major conclusion out of this?
Yes, and fortunately, after Katrina, the, you know, very serious, you know, congressional investigation afterwards, you know, there's a congressional book, The Failure of the Initiative, that goes through that, and the laws were changed. And so now the director of FEMA has to be someone who has demonstrated experience in emergency management. And Craig Fugate, who is the current director of FEMA, you know, came up through the ranks, literally from being a volunteer fireman in Florida to now the director of FEMA. There will be no more Michael Browns. But, you know, it's always after the fact that we learn that lesson. The harder part is learning that lesson all the way down through the state and the county, parish, municipal levels. So you get mayors in the cities that have known exposure to risk to understand what the emergency procedures are and to build that capacity, not only with their emergency services, but with the local businesses and with the local NGOs that are around. Yes.
So to think about disasters on a global level, in many of the areas or countries where disasters happen or likely to happen, as we well know, government and political infrastructure is weak or non-existent, or concentrating on whether to buy Uzis or AK-47s rather than that kind of planning. So then NGOs come in, and you showed with your very short arrows the problems in terms of NGOs who frequently do good work individually, but leave the government infrastructure as pathetic as it was before. I know this is a huge problem and it's been discussed for many years, but having studied this, and what can we do to, or what are your ideas about the forces that can help networks develop in a more salubrious process for the future?
I honestly believe in coming in under the radar, and I do think that universities have a key role in doing that. What was really hopeful to me is looking at both Haiti and Japan. You have people that are in that situation. They are not sitting by. They are getting up. They are picking up their shovels. They are trying literally to help one another. The difficulty is connecting, and you know, you have a situation in Haiti where you've got, you know, seriously underdeveloped, you know, people that, you know, a large level of illiteracy, you know, 56% literacy in the country, lots of people that find it very difficult to follow written instructions. But if you show them, if you give them an example, if you engage with them, they're very eager to learn. And so this is where I think the international community really needs to examine what it is it's doing, how it is it's doing this, and build these connections with countries that do have known risk ahead of time. UN OCHA's response has only been for relief after the disaster. I would just tip that and put it in a preparedness or assessment of risk before the disaster. We know where the earthquakes occur. We know the patterns of hurricane transmission. We know the likelihood of flood. We know where the rivers are, so we know where the floods are going to be. It's not that we don't have knowledge. We just haven't integrated that knowledge in the way that not only communities can use, but the international organizations that want to do good, that want to help, that spend time and resources, that aren't often used very well.
Just a problem with integrating knowledge, you also have the problem of rumors, especially with the social media devices that are out there. We just 2 weeks ago had a serious situation in the United States where a rumor was proliferated on Twitter that there was a bombing at the White House and all that, President Obama was hurt. And this sent the stock market tumbling. I'm wondering if there are ways to put some common sense into these networks, some stoppers before rumors can spread.
Oh, absolutely. You know, at my center, we're developing a prototype decision support system. But a very important part of that system is updating, correcting the error, and building this. And you know, that really means a sort of continual process of monitoring, correction, and update. And most decision processes don't have that. But as you so rightly pointed out, especially in rapidly changing, uncertain, you know, situations where, you know, someone can, you know, get a report or think something, send an immediate, you know, message out. It gets retweeted and repeated, and you've got a different situation. But using, and we're just learning how to update and correct them. What kind of filters can public agencies put on them? You know, if we use these media, do we also need to have a fact-checking process? You know, most local emergency management agencies, you know, do have some kind of fact-checking. And I will say, it's easier to do if you've got a knowledge base in place before this event, so you know where the risks are, where the resources are, what the communication strategies are, and you can correct it literally almost instantly. But it needs thinking about, yes.
Just one last thought.
Sorry, I think we are out of time. So,
Can we make it quickly?
maybe, yes. Last one.
Just 10 years ago, the National Public TV predicted 4 major disasters. It predicted tornadoes hitting Dallas, a hurricane hitting New Orleans and a hurricane hitting New York and flooding. And the fourth one was the San Francisco earthquake, and I'm sort of expecting that next year.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So we are meeting at 10:30 here for the first panel. You are very welcome to attend. Thank you, Professor Comfort, for this wonderful speech and our audience for this wonderful discussion. Thanks.
Thanks, Louise. That was great. It's interesting comparing Haiti and Japan because you almost have two opposite cultures. You have one where